Well, so what does Easter mean to me? Well, I think perhaps my surroundings might give you a clue, or maybe not. I think if I ate this much chocolate, that might make me ill. So, what does Easter mean to me? I think Easter is a fresh realisation of who Jesus actually is. There are quite a lot of characters in the Easter story. If many of you will recall all the various episodes of what went on at Easter. If we start with the Last Supper, what we call the Last Supper, the Passover meal that Jesus shared with his disciples. They probably thought that after being with him for around 3 years, they knew him quite well and they pretty well got him sussed. And they'll have heard him saying, oh, you're meant to serve other people and put others first, and yeah, fine, happy with that. And then he got the bowl of water and the towel and he started washing their feet. They weren't expecting that. That would be the job of the lowliest servant, and there was Jesus doing it. Peter was quite flabbergasted. I guess then they got a bit of a fresh insight into who Jesus was. The high priest's servant later on that evening, who had his ear cut off, he wouldn't have expected Jesus to stick it back on again. He must have thought, wow, who is this guy? Even Judas. Now Judas must have been plotting this betrayal for quite some time. He had it all, the details worked out to a fine art. And yet, the following morning, after he'd done the deed, he went to the high priest and said, this man's innocent. I've betrayed an innocent man. Judas had a fresh realisation of who Jesus really was. Unfortunately, it was too late then. Judas threw the money at the high priests and then went and killed himself, of course. Then there was the criminal who was on the cross next door to Jesus on what we call Good Friday, who, after probably a life of crime, once he'd experienced being, with Jesus, he then said, Jesus, remember me when you come to glory. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. He, even hanging on that cross, that criminal had a fresh realisation of who Jesus actually was. And of course the Roman soldier later on that day, round about sort of in the afternoon, when the Jesus bodily died and the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom, and the soldier just said, modern paraphrase, said, wow, this man really was the Son of God. Again, a fresh recognition or realisation of perhaps who Jesus really was. Mary Magdalene on the Sunday morning thought she was speaking to the gardener. Jesus said her name, and it suddenly, miraculously, she realised who Jesus was, and then, she bowed down and worshipped him. But that was symbolic, I guess, but a sudden, fresh realisation of who Jesus was. And a similar episode in many ways when the Cleopas and his other friends were going on the road back home to Emmaus, and Jesus walked with them, and God kept them from seeing who he was. But then during the meal, when he broke bread, there was suddenly a fresh realisation, a fresh recognition, a new recognition of who Jesus was. Okay, those last two were symbolic, but I think they're pointing to what I'm saying about people suddenly discovering or realising or recognising Jesus, which of course Thomas himself did a week later, when at first he didn't believe his friends because he wasn't there when Jesus appeared to him, and then when Jesus appeared to Thomas and said, feel my wounds, and Thomas then had a fresh recognition of Jesus. He saw him almost in a new light. The fishing trip, when the disciples were fishing and caught nothing, and then Jesus guided them appeared on the beach, guided them to cast their nets again, and they caught 153 fish. And they suddenly realised who he was. And finally, of course, and this is probably one of my favourite stories of all, when following that barbecue meal, when Jesus kept saying to Peter, "Now, do you love me?" And Peter must have felt, gosh, this is a really awkward conversation, because he obviously realised that Jesus knew that he denied him 3 times on that fateful Thursday evening. And yet it was probably a conversation he didn't want to have with Jesus, really. I mean, I wouldn't. I'd feel really awkward. But then Jesus graciously forgave him and just kept asking him to reaffirm his love for him, and then commissioned him to go out and be a missionary, I guess, feed my sheep. So all those episodes in the Easter story where people recognised Jesus afresh, or realised again, perhaps the penny dropped, as we say, perhaps realised who Jesus was. And maybe this Easter it's time for us to ask Jesus to give us a fresh realisation or insight into who he really is. Easter egg, anyone?